in regards to intensity and relevancy to the day that we're in today compared to Prophets 3. Prophets 3 is really the essence of Bible prophecy, eschatology. Prophets 4, for the most part, we're going to be looking back historically of the period of these prophets. The only one of the prophets here that has a bearing on actual eschatology prophecy is Zechariah. And so we'll spend a little time looking at Zechariah because, again, it's not just historic with him, it's relevant to our time. And we do want to focus on what's relevant. So, here we are, we're Prophets 4. Now, we're not going to spend a tremendous amount of time in Prophets 4. We're actually going to try and get through Prophets 4 as quickly as we can so we can get to the New Testament. So we'll concentrate on what's absolutely relevant in Prophets 4. So here we go. Prophets 4. Tonight we're going to attempt to do class 1 and class 2. We'll see how far we get. In your material, class 1 is an introduction. Introduction to Prophets 4. Well, we just call it an introduction. And of course, we're going to look also at the major prophetic themes. All right. A couple of Hebrew words. The first word in Hebrew is melach. Anybody knows what the word melach is? Melach. Melach is king. Melach? No? Messenger or angel? So melach is messenger or angel. Melech is king. You've heard of melech before. So melach with an A, I guess it would be, is angel or messenger. All right. Then we have another from class. This would be class 2. We have a Hebrew phrase or expression. It is, anybody knows what that word is? Ear. Which is city? Ear, city. All right. Tav. So it's ʕ-meҭ. Let me decorate this here. No. Emeth. So it is ʕ-meҭ. Anybody knows what it means? City of truth. Or city. Emeth. Emeth is true or reality. City of truth or reality. All right. So we're going to try and get through Prophets 4. Tonight, again, we're going to aspire to get class 1 and class 2 done. We'll see how far we get. I'll have to move rapidly through class 1. All right, so who remembers the 4 categories of prophets? The 4 categories of prophets. The first category of prophets is All right. You can go back and look in your material. Early warning. What does that mean, early warning prophet? What does that mean? Just what it says. Mm-hmm. Who were some of the early warning prophets? You can look back in your material. Isaiah. Who else? What about the northern kingdom? Early warning prophets. Then the second category of prophets are prophets interpreting the exile. Who remembers some of those? Who were those prophets? Jeremiah. Who else? Who? Amos. Amos. And who else? Hosea. Habakkuk and Zephaniah in the south. Then the third category, prophets to the exile, which was, who were? No. Ezekiel. And Ezekiel and who else? Must do a PowerPoint for this. Daniel and, well, John in the book of Revelation. And then the last category of prophets we're going to look at, beginning tonight, are the prophets to the restored remnant. So we're dealing with prophets that are appointed by God to minister to the restoration that occurred with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel, heralded by King Cyrus. So these are the prophets we're looking at. Now this restoration or ingathering was a partial ingathering. It was not a complete and finite ingathering. You follow me? So Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11 says that God will bring Israel back a second time. So there would be a second restoration to the land of Israel. The first restoration is this restoration, which is temporary and partial. Right? We have to keep that in mind. Lest we get confused with the prospect that the restoration has failed, and so now we can begin to embrace replacement theology. God said that He would implement two restoration processes. And this is the first one, and so He raised up prophets specifically to deal with this remnant return. And who were the prophets that were appointed for this time? Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So the three prophets that God appointed for this function, Haggai, and Malachi. Now, also in this section, we're going to look at three books that are not books of the prophets, or they're not prophets, they're just books that deals with this period. And this is a very important period. You can refer to this as the intertestament period, the period between the two testaments, but really it has to do with the partial ingathering and that period. So the three books we're going to look at also is Ezra. What other books you think? Nehemiah. That's how you mess that up. And then Esther. Book of Esther. Hopefully in 3 weeks or in third class from now, we'll look at the book of Esther. Very important book, very impressive in regards to its symbolic meaning. And we'll spend an entire class on the book of Esther. So, let's begin to look at these prophets. And I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to try and move along as fast as I can, as you can tell. So, in Isaiah chapter 44 and 45, we see a reference in there concerning King Cyrus. Mentions him by name, Cyrus. Isaiah prophesied some 200 or 250 years before the coming of Cyrus. But yet we see Isaiah in Isaiah 44 and 45 mentioning Cyrus by name, which of course is quite amazing. Now, sometimes you would hear people say that Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, did not prophesy or did not actually write the entire book of Isaiah, however you want to look at that. But Isaiah chapter 1 to 39 was directly inspired or written, as some people will say. We don't know if Isaiah actually wrote. More than likely he had scribes that would have written for him. At any rate, so some scholars would say, both Jewish and Christian, that Isaiah 1 to 39 was actually inspired, written by Isaiah. Isaiah 40 to 66 was written by the school of Isaiah, or pupils, students that followed after Isaiah. And so how do we feel about that? Well, we've talked about that before. I think we can totally reject that. The argument is that Isaiah 40 to 66 is far too accurate in terms of subsequent history that will come, and therefore the lack of faith, lack of belief that the prophet could have been that accurate with his prophecies, they've concluded that those chapters must have been written long after the events prophesied had actually occurred. And so you can tell by that statement, which is their statement, that they are not coming from a place of faith. They're coming from a place of just trying to analyze things in the natural. And I call that error. I call it folly. No, we ought to accept by faith that the entire book of Isaiah was inspired and written by Isaiah or by his scribes, more than likely by his scribes. The prophet Isaiah would have had a following, a school, an ecclesia in the English. He would have had a Knesset, a group of people that would have met with him and follow him around and write for him. The prophets would have been treated that way for sure. And Isaiah wrote the entire book. So Isaiah rightly prophesied concerning Cyrus. What did he say about Cyrus? We read this when we studied in Isaiah. He referred to Cyrus as his servant, his shepherd, and that that Cyrus would be the one to rebuild the temple. And the amazing thing about it is the temple was not destroyed when Isaiah said this, when Isaiah saw this and prophesied concerning this. And yet, it's prophesied very boldly in Isaiah chapter 45. And again, the references are in 44 and 45. I think we've read this before, and perhaps we may not need to read this again. All right, so I would recommend that you read it on your own. So very clearly, very, very concisely, Isaiah saw this. And it was Daniel who, in the diaspora, began to acknowledge the prophecy of Jeremiah concerning the rebuilding of the temple. And the emphasis of the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem was really initiated by Daniel. All right, you find it in Daniel chapters 9, verse 3, 4, 17 onwards. Daniel's prayer for the rebuilding of the temple. This year when we go to Israel, we're going to be singing a song. It's our primary song that's really taken from that chapter, Daniel chapter 9, that Daniel prayed. The song is actually the prayer of Daniel when he realized that the time had come to rebuild the temple. And he called out, he cried out to God. He said, God, let your face shine upon us. We're calling upon your name, God. Please hear us, which is, again, the building of the temple. So this Daniel's recognition of Jeremiah's prophecy really initiated this move towards the rebuilding of the temple. And, of course, it was inspired by God. And then by the time the Babylonians were taken over and then Cyrus came, of course, Daniel interacted with Cyrus. And so you had this incredible drive, this incredible initiative of the rebuilding of the temple. And so by the time the other Persian kings came along, it was definitely a movement. And Ezra, Zerubbabel, and those in Persia was actually pushing that agenda as well. So God moved on the heart of King Cyrus. He made a decree in 539 BC. He made that decree that the temple should be rebuilt. And considering the fact that Cyrus was a Persian emperor, and the Persian Empire was a pagan empire, that's pretty remarkable, right? So it says that Cyrus had acknowledged the reality of the God of Israel. His inspiration would have come from Daniel and those also inspired by Daniel. So just like with Isaiah, Daniel, being an anointed prophet in Babylon, in his case, would have had a school of prophets and students that would have scribes and so on that would have followed him. In other words, Daniel would have had an ecclesia, a Knesset, an assembly. People that were faithful to the message of Daniel, and they would have been faithful to Torah at the same time, faithful to the prospect of the rebuilding of the temple, and they would have continued the agenda. So what happened? Well, the temple, we know the temple was rebuilt. The second temple was rebuilt. Ezra was a scribe who worked together with the Persian kings. Ezra was appointed to return and begin the process of the restoration of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple. And Nehemiah followed as well. Nehemiah and, of course, Nehemiah and Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the builder. Nehemiah was the governor. But Ezra was the real, I guess you can say, the real force, the real anointing is probably a better word. Ezra was the real anointing behind the movement. He had the authority, the spiritual authority, and it was Ezra who really got behind the entire movement. Again, Zerubbabel built that temple. Now, the second temple was simply an edifice. It wasn't really a temple, because for it to be a temple, it would mean that God dwelt there, right? The presence of God is nowhere recorded in the Bible in that second temple, nowhere. And so you might be able to say, well, we can assume that His presence was there because it was His temple. Well, what I would say to that is this: with the tabernacle and with the first temple, when God moved in, signifying that He was there, it was very vivid, very profound. He made a show of it, very, very vividly. The kavod Yehovah, the glory of God, the glory of the Lord, moved in, and it's recorded twice. You don't see anything like that when the temple was built in Jerusalem. Surely, if something like that had happened, it would have been recorded in the book of Ezra or Nehemiah. But there's nothing like that there at all. It seems like they built the temple, they consecrated it, and they did a good thing, and the temple was consecrated. So I would say that the temple really wasn't a temple, it was an edifice. An edifice, a shell of the temple, of a temple. It really wasn't a temple. Now, let's get a little background here on the era that we're talking about. We're talking about the era, of course, of the the Persian, the Medo-Persian Empire. What do we know about the Medo-Persians? Well, we know a little bit. We can only discuss a little bit about them. They were a Japhetic people. They were not Hamitic. Although the Medes were far enough east to be somewhat Hamitic, mixed with the Hamitic peoples. At this time, the sons of Noah and their descendants more or less stayed together. So we're talking about this period, which was about 3,000 years after Babel, roughly, within a couple hundred years. And the peoples more or less still stayed together. The sons of Japheth stayed together, and so on and so on and so on. But now the Medes were probably far enough east, mixed with the Hindus, today's Hindus, with the Indians, that would be considered Hamitic. So with the Medo Empire, you probably had a mix of Japhetic and Hamitic peoples. Now, the Persians were definitely Japhetic, and they were different. They were not like the Semitic Babylonians and Assyrians. The Semitic Babylonians and Assyrians were much more aggressive. They took their pattern of empire building from the ancient Sumerians, which was Nimrod's empire, and they patterned themselves after Nimrod, more or less, after the Sumerians. And they were very brutal, very warlike, very aggressive. They did all the things that the forerunner of their empires did, which was, again, to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies, to incite war wherever necessary. The Japhetic Persians were different. They had a much more civilized or civil approach to governing their empires. They would render the different states of their empire autonomous. Again, their system of governance was entirely different, and seemed to be good from our point of view, right? Our genteel point of view seems to be a better way to run an empire, but it wasn't, not in this time. So the Persians came along and they introduced something much different actually than the Semitic Babylonians and the Assyrians. And by the way, the Babylonians and the Assyrians were all Semitic. They were all descendants of Shem. We don't think of it that way, but they absolutely were. They were Arameans. They spoke Aramean for the most part, and they were related to Abraham, to Haran, and the descendants of Shem. So they were very brutal, whereas the Persians were much more diplomatic, much more prone to seeking better ways of governing, more civilized, like I said, ways of governing. So again, they would give autonomy to the states that they've conquered, and then that's in keeping with what Cyrus did with Jerusalem, right? He basically gave Jerusalem back to the Jewish people, said it's okay to build your temple and to serve your God. Of course, I believe Cyrus knew the God of the Bible as God. That's probably the case. But the other kings from Assyria didn't really serve the God of Israel. They served a host of other gods. They were pagans. Zoroastrianism was sort of the official religion, but then it was more pagan. So it was not only Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is sort of an offshoot of ancient Judaism, where you serve one God. His name was Mazda. It's kind of complicated that way. But to say enough is to say that the Persians were different. Now we know that the Persians had a real issue with the Grecians. Right? The Persians, they struggled to maintain the span of the kingdom that they inherited from the Babylonians. They attempted to go further east across the Indus Valley and didn't quite get over there and didn't conquer what became India, but attempted to, but they managed to keep that east of Persia, east of today's Iran, at bay. In other words, the Indians, who we call Indians today, East Indians, did not prevail upon the Medo-Persian Empire because they wanted to stay on that side of the Indus Valley and be left alone, which they did. So the arch enemy of the Persians was, of course, the Greeks. Now the Greeks, of course, led by Alexander the Great, Alexander was Grecian, you know, of course. He was the son of, what was his father's name? Was his father's name Aristotle's? I guess his dad was Aristotle's, right? Something like that. Well, he descended from the great philosophers of Greece, Plato and Aristotle. I believe you might want to check me on that. You fact checkers, check me on that. Nevertheless, this young general representing the Grecian Empire ultimately defeated the mighty Persian Empire. Now, there were many battles between the Greeks and the Persians, two major battles between the Greeks and the Persians. The first one was Marathon. You've heard of Marathon? The battle occurred at Marathon. Now, what does the word marathon has to do with people running? This is where it came from. A runner was sent back from the battle to give the report to Greece that they were prevailing over the Persians. And this is around 490 BC. So that was a great defeat for the Persians, 490 BC. I think there was a movie recently, I think it was called, what was the name of that movie, dealing with this marathon battle? 300 or something? 200? Whatever. But it's sort of a fantastical rendering of this battle. I mean, I saw some of the movie. I couldn't stand to see all of it. And it presented the Grecians as almost a supernatural army of men, and they had powers from the gods and so on. So, but nevertheless, they did defeat the Persians at Marathon. Then there was another battle at Salamis in 480 BC, 10 years later. And again, the Persians were beaten back. Now, it was Alexander that determined that the Persians will not cease to attack us. So the only thing we can do is to attack them, destroy their kingdom. It's the only way we can ensure that they don't continue to attack us. Now, the Grecians were Japhetic as well, right? But they were a little different. They were much more defensive than the normal Japhetic people. The normal Japhetic peoples, they went further north, and they lived very, very genteel, very civilized, well, not civilized, but very isolated existences, and that's how they wanted it. You know, the ones that went further north, even though they were pagans and they got involved in very occultic things. But the Grecians now were warlike, and so were the Romans, right? The Romans were also Japhetic. And the Grecians were warriors. They were powerful, they were strong and capable warriors. Too much for the Persians, way too much for the Persians. The Persians had numbers. Their numbers vastly exceeded the Grecians. Again, you're talking about two empires consolidated as one, the Persians and the Medes and the Persians. So they had the numbers. What they didn't have was the sheer determination of the Grecians. So in Daniel chapter 7, actually 8, we see the account of the ram with one horn that comes from the east, and it bolts across the east, comes quickly and destroys the sheep, or the sheep with the two horns. The sheep with the two horns was the Medo-Persian Empire. The two horns meaning two kingdoms, the Medo-Persian Empire. The ram that came from the west with the one horn, of course, one leader, one king, was Alexander. Alexander swiftly descended upon the Medo-Persian Empire and had a very quick victory. In fact, wherever Alexander went, wherever he conquered, he did it very quickly, swiftly, and effectively, fulfilling what Daniel saw in Daniel chapter 8. Alexander the Great became known as Alexander the Great because wherever he went, he left the people with this insight of who Alexander was. He was a king who would lead his people into battle. He would be the first warrior over the wall. He would be at the front of the charge, and that's what made him great. Wherever he went, people knew that this king is different than the other kings because he's at the front of the battle, and he's the first guy over the wall. And so he became known as Alexander the Great principally because of that. He was a true leader in that sense. But in a mere 10 years or so, he fell and he became elevated. In his mind, he became a divine being, and he didn't last too much longer after that. We know the story there. So now some of the kings of Persia that were notable kings, of course Cyrus, he was of course Cyrus the Great, a notable king. Also Cambyses. Cambyses was also a notable king, nothing like Cyrus the Great, of course. And then you had other kings. These two kings now fought against the Grecian Empire. You had Darius and Xerxes, Artaxerxes or Xerxes. They were the kings who fought against the Grecian Empire, defended the Persian Empire from the Greeks. All right? So that's a little bit of background there on the period that we're looking at here relative to the Persian Empire. So let's take a look at these prophets. Who are the prophets? Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So what do we know about Haggai? Not much. Not much at all. We know that Haggai was likely one of the exiles who returned from Persia, because his ministry was directly connected and associated with Ezra and the returnees from Persia or from Babylon. That area continued to be called Babylon, by the way, by the Israelites. It continued to be called Babylon. Later on, it was defined as the Medo-Persian Empire. But so when you say they came back from Babylon, well, that's the region that we're talking about. In other words, even after the Persians took Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon and subdued it, the entire region was always known as Babylon. For instance, Susa, which is the capital of Persia, was considered to be Babylon by the Israelites. So Haggai came back from Babylon with the ones who were appointed by the king of Persia to return and begin the process of the rebuilding of the temple. Again, Ezra was the one who was specifically appointed by the king of Persia, but he was most definitely anointed by God to begin that process. And he certainly did. So Haggai's message, what was his message? His message was, gird up, make yourselves strong, in other words, for the rebuilding of the temple, that the rebuilding of the temple was paramount, and that you had to pull yourself together, Israel, be upright in heart, because the building of the temple is everything. So Zerubbabel was the actual builder, right? He wasn't a governor, he wasn't a Bible teacher, he was a builder sent from Persia. It's evident here that the prophet Haggai worked alongside Zerubbabel to encourage Zerubbabel in the building of the temple. So this was the ministry of Haggai. Not much is known about him, his family background, and why would that be? Because he was a returnee from Babylon. Now, the fact that he was in Babylon can denote that he originally, or his lineage was originally a royal class. We can assume that. We can come to that conclusion. But by the time he gets to Babylon and returns to Jerusalem, that's not much of a factor anymore. All right, because following the return, there was not a king of the house of David, of the royal class, that ruled over Israel following the return. It just wasn't a son of David, right? Because that lineage had been cut off. But many of the descendants of the house of David were taken to Babylon and did in fact return to the land of Israel. So why is it that there was no son of David king to take the throne in Jerusalem once the ingathering began? Why was there no son of David sitting on a throne in Jerusalem? What do you think? Yeah, Zedekiah was right. His eyes were taken out. His two sons were killed. But there were many other descendants of the house of David. Daniel was likely a descendant of the house of David. Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah, they were probably all Hananel, they were probably all descendants and connected, associated with the house of David. So strictly speaking, one of them could have become king, house of David, king ruling in Jerusalem. A very simple answer. The Babylonians would not have allowed it, and the Persians would not have allowed it at all, neither would the Grecians. Now the Romans did tolerate Herod, right? You know the story of King Herod? Well, he actually wasn't a king as such, but he claimed to be a king. He claimed to be the king of Israel. But he was not an Israelite. He was an Idumean who was converted by the Hashmoneans. The Hashmoneans were the rulers that descended from the Maccabees. So you had the Maccabees, the Maccabee revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes, 165 BC. And from the Maccabees, the Kohanim, who were the Maccabees, came the Hashmonean Empire. The Hashmoneans, the Maccabees, conquered a region in today's Jordan, then Amman, the sons of Ammon, called Idumea. And Idumeans were Ammonites. And so Herod was an Ammonite. He wasn't an Israelite. But he claimed heritage, and probably there was some intermarrying and so on. So he may have had some actual Hashmonean blood in him. Who knows? But he became king, but he was never really a sovereign king. So there was never again a sovereign son of David king ruling in Jerusalem following Zedekiah, who was the last king, son of David. But there were other qualified candidates. They were just not able to take the throne. Now, part of that is, of course, prophetic. All right, because the next son of David to rule in Jerusalem is King Jesus. All right, that's the idea of the Tzemach, and that when Zedekiah when he died in Babylon, his eyes plucked out, his sons killed before him. That was it. The tree was cut down, and then the Tzemach would be the one who would be king. The stem of Jesse, the stem of Jesse, the root of David. Who would be the Tzemach? All right, but there were rulers in Jerusalem. Nehemiah was a governor, but he certainly wasn't a sovereign king. So during the governorship of Nehemiah, the king was the Persian king, whoever the Persian king was. Because that empire, the Persian Empire, had controlled governance over the land of Israel. So Israel never became a sovereign state again, and has never been a sovereign state until when? 1948. So 1948, rightly, they can appoint a king, but they will not appoint a king. There's some people that are saying that Bibi Netanyahu should be appointed king. Well, we know that's not going to happen. So in the last 65 years or so, the state of Israel has been a sovereign state, but at the same time, we're still sort of under the control of the United Nations, and to some extent, this nation, right? The United States, our foreign policy, in conjunction with the UN, for decades now, has basically governed Israel behind the scenes, right? So it's still not completely sovereign, not yet. So let's get back to Haggai. Haggai was this prophet. No background on him at all. We know that his ministry, his message was all about the rebuilding of the temple. No, that was a big deal, right? The rebuilding of the temple, because they already saw that the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar Babylonians, and there was always the prospect that if they build up a temple again, that they will be attacked again as a result of that. So, and they had resistance from all around. They had resistance from every direction as they began to build that second temple. And so the issue was, there was a lot of fear and trepidation and hesitancy about the rebuilding of the temple. That's why these three prophets were raised up expressly for that purpose. And Malachi, his message was associated with the temple, but a little different. But Haggai and Zechariah, these two prophets were raised up, and their primary message was, we've got to get the temple built. We've got to have the function of the Kohanim, the Levites, in place. So let's talk about Zechariah. We know a little more about Zechariah than we do about Haggai. What do we know about Zechariah? He was a Kohanim. He was a Levite, not only a Levite, he was a descendant of Aaron, a Kohanim. He was a priest and also a prophet. Who do we know that was also a priest and a prophet? Well, before Zechariah, we know Ezekiel. Ezekiel was also a Kohanim and a prophet at the same time. Now, Zechariah is a unique prophet, much like Daniel and somewhat like Ezekiel, because he reported or gave many of his messages based on visions. So he's what I want to call a visionary prophet. He had visions, and based on his visions, he would scribe his message. So no doubt Zechariah also would have had a scribe working with him, and his visions would have been reported. He would have given his night visions, his dreams or his visions to his scribe, and it would have been scribed Zechariah chapter 2, Zechariah chapter 4, Zechariah chapter 6. It's just throughout the book of Zechariah, you have all these visions, and the visions becomes the basis for his messages. So he's different in that sense than Haggai and Malachi. Now, I'm not saying that Haggai or Malachi or any of the other prophets didn't also have visions. They probably did, but they were not reported. They were not recorded, and those prophets didn't give a message based on their visions. We don't know that for sure, but I would like to think that the other prophets would have also had visions and dreams that were relevant to the message that they gave. We just don't see them. But Zechariah gives us a tremendous amount of visions, at least 6 of them that are profound, that has to do with end-time events. The most profound, I think, would be Zechariah chapter 12, 13 and 14, the series of visions that he has. The most conclusive of the 3, of course, is in Zechariah chapter 14, when he sees the Lord who puts his foot on the Mount of Olives. And there's an earthquake, and from that point on, there's some events that takes place, and the kingdom of God is established in Jerusalem. And then he also sees the nations streaming into Jerusalem once a year to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And that for Zechariah would have been a really profound vision, because Zechariah lived at a time when Israel was subservient to all the nations around them. Very, very subdued. And so to have a vision where Israel becomes the center of all the nations, where the nations are coming up to Jerusalem to celebrate Feast of Tabernacles, that must have been a striking and impressive vision for Zechariah. And is for us today. The difference between us today and people of 65 years ago and before is that we're seeing Israel becoming the head of all the nations and not the tail. In other words, we're seeing the series of events that's necessary for Israel to become that centerpiece of all the nations, where the nations will come up to Jerusalem and honor God's feasts in Jerusalem. And so we live in a very exciting time. Now, prior to this last 65 years or so, since 1948, it was always a point of faith on behalf of the Jewish people, the sons of Israel, to believe that that would happen. Because, of course, not only Zechariah talked about the time when Israel would be the center of all the nations, the other prophets did as well. And so it was always a point of faith on behalf of the Jewish people for that expectancy, for that to be fulfilled. And you can imagine how many prayers were offered up over the last 2 millennia for that to come to fruition. Endless. Now, the church, believers like us, we've only began to see this, or in large numbers, I think, for the last 500 years. There's been this movement of Christian restorationists, what we call Zionists today. the real essence of the message of a Christian Zionist has to be centered around the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the reestablishment of the nation of Israel. That's the real essence of the message of a Christian Zionist. Now, you have a lot of people who claim Christian Zionism today, and their message varies. It's usually very Christian with a talit, Christian with a overtone of Jewishness, and that doesn't make it kosher. You can wear a tzitzit and a yarmulke, you can speak Hebrew and have a Jewish-style service, doesn't mean that you're kosher as a Christian. As a Christian, you're only kosher if you're biblical and you're fitted into that biblical mandate for who we are as Christians, to stand alongside Israel, to encourage them to be the people that God has called them to be. If you're acting like a Jew and you're doing Jewish things, again, it doesn't make you necessarily kosher. So Christian Zionists, we've been around for a long time. I mean, the first century church, they were Christian Zionists, the Nazarene. But after the Reformation is when we see the build-up that led to where we are today. But even before 65 years ago, for Christians, it was always a point of faith that the restoration would occur. Many Christians believed this and preached it and vested into it with their resources. They sent funds to Israel for the literal building up of the land of Israel. Now, Jewish historians who would be honest about this issue would tell you that the Christian Zionist has always been a great part of that thrust towards the restoration of the land of Israel. That the Christian Zionists had always had this incredible faith that it would happen. And it was happening. Who's the father of the modern Zionist movement? Theodor Herzl, right? Theodor Herzl is the father of the modern day Zionist movement. Well, the encouragement or the thrust of Theodor's drive was given to was Christian, a Christian pastor, so-called restorationist, who we would call a Christian Zionist. This Christian pastor, German name, I can't remember his name. He was the one that encouraged Theodor Herzl to do what Theodor did. And Theodor, of course, he was Jewish, he was secular, didn't really believe, but began to express faith, some faith, later on in his life. And that came from a Christian believer, a restorationist. So we've always been involved in that process. But today we're seeing so much more vividly, openly, that this is the time of the restoration, that God is now restoring the people. It's just so vivid. Zechariah saw this time. Zechariah chapter 12 to 14 puts the emphasis on this time. We're going to study Zechariah chapter 12 particularly because Zechariah chapter 12 ties into what we've been studying in the book of Revelation, Daniel chapter 7. Let me say this, Zechariah chapter 12 is Armageddon, this great conflict, but from a different perspective. From the perspective of the inclusion of the Jewish state. All right, so when we read in the book of Revelation and in Daniel chapter 7 about this end time specter that will come upon the earth, we saw no references to the Jewish people. But Zechariah chapter 12 introduces the reality that Israel will be at the center of this great conflict. Zechariah 12 is Armageddon. And we'll study Zechariah chapter 12 at another time. Zechariah gave us a wonderful vision as well concerning the menorah, the seventh stand candle stand, the seventh lamp candle stand. It wasn't a candle stand, oil. They used oil. They didn't use candles at that time. So the seventh stand oil lamp, the menorah. He saw this vision of the menorah, and it's an outstanding vision because on either side of the menorah he saw the olive branches, also referred to them as the olive trees, but they were being supplied, they were being anointed by, or the anointing came from the menorah, which again, like we talked about before, is exactly the opposite of reality. The reality is the oil for the menorah came from the olive trees. But in what Zechariah saw, he saw the olive tree being supplied its anointing by the menorah. Then no, it was confusing to him. Zechariah was confused about this. Zechariah was a Kohanim. And probably he was directly involved in the processing of the olives that would have been used in the temple. One of the things that's pretty amazing to me is that whenever you find archaeological evidence of the second temple period even, you see that there's a shofar, a menorah, and there are jars. And you see them on seals, inscriptions, on scrolls, sometimes you see them. So those three items are together, menorah, shofar, and jars. What are the jars? The jars are jars of oil. And the oil is cold pressed olive oil. Virgin, it has to be virgin, of course, but cold press. Cold press meaning that you couldn't steam the olives to extract the oil much easier. You had to grind the olives raw, cold, and extract the oil. Very difficult. But the oil that you would get from the cold pressed olives was the best, natural, pure, and that's what was required for the temple, right? So the oil that we get at Kedumim from Avi, it's cold pressed. It's processed the same way that the oil was processed on the Mount of Olives. That's why the mount is called the Mount of Olives. The olive trees were there. And so Zechariah would have had direct knowledge of the oil and processing of the oil. He was a Kohanim. Across the temple, down in the valley on Gethsemane, what we call Gethsemane, was the olive grove that went all the way up the Mount of Olives. And from those trees, they would process olives for the work of the temple. And the priests were directly involved in that. So Zechariah is standing there or laying there. He's having this vision. And he's seeing something that's not natural to him. Because he very well knows that the olive trees produces the oil for the menorah. In this vision, there were pipes coming from the menorah that were supplying oil to the trees. So he was perplexed. And he kept asking the angel, what is this that I'm seeing here? I don't get it. The angel finally told him, the angel said, you don't know what this is. You can't figure this out. It's as if the angel was saying, you ought to figure this out. You ought to understand that the menorah is really a picture of the Lord of the whole earth. And that's what the angel said to him. The menorah is the Lord of the whole earth. The two olive trees are the two anointed ones standing by the Lord of the whole earth. And that was the interpretation of the vision. The word there that's used in the Hebrew for standing is, the root word there is emeth, which means servant or servant. So the two servants of God standing on either side of the Lord of the whole earth was this vision that Zechariah had. And the angel wouldn't leave him until he gave the complete interpretation of it. So it was necessary for us to understand this, right? So the angel was particular, kept dealing with Zechariah. Zechariah kept asking questions about that vision until the interpretation was given. The interpretation is relevant to us because as you studied in Revelation chapter 11, we saw the same vision, right? Menorah, two anointed ones, the witnesses, right? So the trees are indicative of the witnesses, the two witnesses. Now, we believe that the two witnesses are the church in Israel, or representatives from the church in Israel. We can say remnants from the church and from Israel. Now, Bible prophecy teachers are determined that the two witnesses are Elijah and Moses. Some say Moses and Enoch, some say Enoch and Elijah, who knows. But the two witnesses in most of Bible prophecy teaching is not the church in Israel. But we maintain that the church and Israel are the two anointed vessels who are called and appointed by God to function alongside the Lord of the whole earth. The two loaves as it relates to Shavuot. So, Zechariah reports this incredible vision, and I think it's one of the most outstanding visions in the entire New Testament. Relevant to us. Very much so relevant to us. Because it reflects who Jesus is. He's the Lord of the whole earth. And he is the menorah. And so I like the menorah as just a quintessential symbol of who Jesus is. The cross, people like the cross. I have no problem with the cross. The cross is meaningful to me what it represents. But if we have to find a symbol that symbolizes Jesus, the menorah is it. It's as far as I'm concerned, the most appropriate symbol for who Jesus is. Anyway, so Zechariah, what else can we say about Zechariah? His message was centered around, of course, the building of the temple, but not just the building of the temple or the rebuilding of the first, second temple. His emphasis was holiness, of course, the consecration of the priesthood. He was a priest. So in Zechariah chapter 6, it makes mention to Yehoshua, who was appointed by God to be the high priest. In Zechariah chapter 3, God gives Zechariah a dream vision, and he shows him Yehoshua, who was to be appointed, anointed to be the high priest. And Zechariah did that, and Yehoshua was the high priest. Yehoshua, in Zechariah chapter 6, is a picture of Yehoshua, who is Jesus. And we'll discover that here in another week or two. All right, so enough about Zechariah. His mission, again, was centered around the rebuilding of the temple, the consecration of the priesthood. So now let's talk about Malachi. Malachi is the last of the prophets in the Old Testament, the Tanakh. Malachi, he prophesied around 460 BC. So he's a little later than Zechariah and Haggai. He's the last of the prophets of the Tanakh. What was his message? His message was the need for purity and consecration in the priesthood. His message wasn't the rebuilding of the temple, because the temple had been rebuilt by the time his ministry came into gear. His message was, as priests, you need to be fully given over to the ministry of priesthood. The priests were somewhat corrupt and laxed in their ministry. And so Malachi, he's basically exhorting them towards righteousness. They were not handling the tithe, the funds that came in for the work of the temple correctly. They were not functioning in full consecration as priests. So his message was geared towards that. He also had a couple of one in particular, a really important vision or prophecy that had to do with end time events, and that's in Malachi chapter 4. It has to do with the resurrection and the time when the kingdom would be established. Okay, so that's Malachi. What else can we say about Malachi? We don't know much else about him. Of course, he was an important prophet. For most Baptists, they would preach on Malachi at least 2 or 3 times a year whenever they decide that the time had come to increase tithes. Most of these churches, and maybe not the modern churches so much, I'm not sure, but I know that the classic evangelical church of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, everything was based on tithing. The message, at some point, the message will point towards being faithful with your finances, if not completely about tithing. The ministry or the minister, the preacher would be close to the financier, the financial agent in the church, and he would find out when tithes are dropping a little bit, and lo and behold, here comes Sunday morning, he's preaching on Malachi. Right, so that's just the way it is in much of Christianity. But I think Christianity has transformed quite a bit, and we're off in a completely different direction. People are giving their tithes with their credit cards, and not even their tithes, they're just given with their credit cards, and it's just a whole different thing right now. But tithing is important, but I don't think you should frame entire messages on it. I've never done that really, once or twice maybe, but it's an important issue, right? And so here Malachi, this tithing, there's an argument that tithing isn't relevant for us as Christians because it has nothing to do with the temple, and that the physical temple is not built, and tithing had to do with bringing your tithes into the temple, into the storehouse of the temple. And so when Jesus came along, he talked about the widow's mite, the story of the widow's mite. Well, what he witnessed at the temple. Everyone was bringing their tithes, mint and cumin, mint, and back then you didn't tithe cash. There was no cash necessarily. Cashes were considered things that you bury in the ground somewhere. Gold, silver. You didn't give gold and silver. Later on, it became a coin. A half a shekel. Shekels came into existence. Later on, and during the time of Jesus, a little bit before, but historically during this period, there wasn't a shekel. There wasn't coins given to the temple. It was produce. Whatever you had, you gave a tenth of it to the work of the temple. Oil, whatever, clothes, food. You gave it what you had, and it was all concentrated on the temple. So there's no temple. So some Christians will say, why do we tithe? There's no temple. Well, other Christians will say, well, the church is a temple. We have to keep the church going. Very much like how the temple was kept going, we have to keep the church going, which is true, effectively. But I think, by and large, the dimension of a church's success has to do with the income. How much money you bring in, that will determine the grade of pastor that you have. The more money you bring in is the better pastor that you can have. Better meaning that the pastor would be more effective, more eloquent or something, a better personality, and he'll attract more people. So most churches function very much like a business. And the principle of tithing is used as a mode of income. It's seen as a mode of income for the church. Well, that's as far as I'm concerned, inappropriate. The churches shouldn't function that way. If people tithe, it goes into, as far as I'm concerned, it goes into a general account, and from that general account, the bills of the church is paid. The necessity of the church is paid. But the leadership must have a position of faith about what comes in. In other words, what comes in should not and cannot be the motivation behind the leadership of the church or the motivation behind the ministry. Too often it is. And again, many churches say, if we don't bring in a good tithe, we're not going to be able to function. Well, that's backwards. It's not backwards, it's inappropriate. And again, today's churches are known for that kind of outlook. So Malachi, his message was really about the fidelity of the priest, the righteousness of the priest, not principally about tithing. And I promise you, 80–90% of the time when Malachi is quoted in churches, it's about tithing. Right? Very little about righteousness of the believers, the need for consecration, but more so about tithing. All right, so let's talk about the other three principles that we have here, who are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel is in here as well, and Esther. So as Ezra was a monumental personality, incredible reformer. Ezra was. He was effectively a Bible teacher. He was a teacher. Ezra, if I'm not mistaken, I believe he was a Cohen as well. You can check me on that, fact check those. But he was a Cohen, I believe. Maybe he wasn't. At any rate, he was a Bible teacher. He had a burden for the people of Israel to return to Torah. I say return to Torah, but they never had Torah when they were in the diaspora. The prospect of Torah was something that pointed back to Sinai and Moses. And some of the kings did have or implement Torah, like Hezekiah. Right? Hezekiah implemented Torah. He had a scroll of the kings were supposed to actually be responsible for the Torah, the scroll, the writings of the Torah. But Torah wasn't a very prevalent part of the life of Israel before the diaspora, obviously because the diaspora occurred. If Torah was an important aspect of their national life, the diaspora would have not occurred. So Ezra returns from Babylon, and in the rubble of the temple, they found the scroll of the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, which, by the way, would have been the only Bible, the only set of scriptures that they would have had at that time. There would have been other writings like the book of Enoch, the book of Jeshur, and so on that would have been relevant but would not have been a part of the Torah. So they found the Torah, and Ezra read the Torah and began to implement the Torah. Finding the Torah scroll in the temple was considered to be a miracle, divine intervention, which it probably was, and that was a sign to Israel that they had to begin to rigidly implement Torah. Ezra's messages, and he was a preacher, a teacher, he must have stood there close to the Temple Mount, or close to the temple, in the courtyard of the temple then, and preached, because he was a preacher, he was a teacher. And by the way, there is a difference between a preacher and a teacher. Some people like to make that distinction really clear. I say there's a fine line. Some people are more prone to teaching. Some people are more prone to preaching. The truth is, every man of God should be a Bible teacher. Should be a teacher. And based on that, you can preach. A preacher without the Bible is not, he's liable to going astray if his basis, if his foundation is not a Bible teacher. So you have to be a Bible teacher and not just a preacher. Now, there's a difference there in regards to the evangelist. The one that we call a preacher, the office that we call that of a preacher today is really the office of an evangelist. Because the word evangelist in the Greek is to preach. Now, the basis of the preacher or the evangelist is still going to be the Torah, still going to be the Bible. Right? It has to be. So you're not going to have a preacher without him being a teacher on some level. But so Ezra was a teacher, and he was also a preacher. I guess you can say when you teach the Bible, you can get stirred up, and then you begin to preach. Some of us preach for too long, but it's good. So he was a teacher. He was also a reformer. He's gone down in history as the great Jewish reformer. Next to Moses is Ezra. Next to Moses is Ezra in Jewish thought. That Ezra is right there. Ezra is the teacher. Now, Ezra, after reading the scroll and realizing the importance of Torah in the life of Israel, particularly at that time, began to preach that message of Torah, the keeping of Torah, fidelity and righteousness before God. And the idea was, his message was, what has happened to us, the northern kingdom and us, has happened because we've drifted away from Torah. We've deserted the righteousness that comes from the Torah. And in order for us to be sustained as a nation, a people, even in the diaspora, because remember that a lot of Israel had gone out into the diaspora at this time, even the northern kingdom. By this time, most of the northern kingdom had fled into the regions of Babylon. They didn't go west, as some two-house people believe. The two houses, or the Bene Ephraimites, they believe that the 10 tribes of Israel, the northern kingdom, went north and west into Europe. I say to that, complete nonsense, because there's no track of that in history, no trace of it in history at all. In fact, we know exactly where the 10 tribes went, most of them anyway. They went to the regions of Babylon and north and east, the so-called Peshmerga Trail, Peshmerga, which went all the way from Babylon, well, northern Syria, to the Himalayas. That's where they were dispersed, and many of them are still there today. Very much so, their descendants are still there today. But by and large, representatives of the 10 tribes of the north stayed together with Judah and Benjamin from the south in the diaspora. But the process of the ingathering at the time of Ezra was very minimal. Most of the sons of Israel were in the diaspora. So Ezra had quite a task. His task was to ensure that the temple was built according to what's revealed in the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, 1, and 2, to begin to implement Torah teaching and Torah lifestyle. He had quite a task. Ezra didn't only work in minister in Jerusalem, he went out into the diaspora as well to teach. It is with Ezra that the institution of the synagogue came into existence. And the synagogue, there was a mandate for the synagogue, the ecclesia outside of Jerusalem, because of the diaspora. All right? So I'm sort of jumping ahead here, but because of the fact that there was a diaspora and there were Jewish communities throughout the diaspora, Babylon, there were Jewish communities in Spain and Portugal, what we know as Spain and Portugal, which was called Tarshish at the time, the Iberian Peninsula. There were Jewish communities over there since King Solomon, and they became more viable communities by the time of Ezra. So Ezra made his journeys, establishing in all those some of those communities the reality of synagogue, Knesset, where Torah would be studied. And that he's the one that really implemented the study of Torah, the so-called pashans, the portions, the weekly portions. And that was designed so that in every assembly, every Knesset in the diaspora, the Torah will be studied year in, year out. It was Ezra that implemented that. So you see, Ezra was a great reformer. Ezra actually is the founder of what we call Judaism. Now, Judaism as an ism really didn't come into existence until the Middle Ages in Europe. But there was always the faith of Israel. The faith of Israel. We call it the religion, if you want. The religion of Israel wasn't always Judaism, known as Judaism. Judaism formed because of the Talmudic scholars in Babylon, and they came to Spain and Portugal. In Spain and Portugal is where they really sort of codified what we know as Judaism, and it's really about 700, 900 years old. So before that, it was just the faith of Israel. Within that faith of Israel, you had different movements. For instance, you had the Karaites, who believed that Torah only, no Talmud, rigid adherence to Torah only, and refusal of Talmud. The Karaites, they still exist today, and they've been around ever since the formation of Judaism. And their rejection of the Talmud ostracized them, made them distinct. They also got involved in some strange practices. The Karaites, the Karaites did. Okay, but there were many movements in the pale of Judaism that you can say were sects, different sects. When Judaism was sort of etched in stone in Spain, is when they decided that they need one movement to govern over the entire pale of Judaism. And they saw themselves as the modern-day Pharisees. The modern-day Pharisees. The word Pharisee comes from the Hebrew word that says holy ones. The holy ones. And so the Pharisees saw themselves as the holy consecrated ones. And actually Ezra was sort of the founder of the Pharisaic movement. Okay, so that's another way to look at Ezra. Now the Pharisees of the New Testament period that Jesus confronted and dealt with were corrupt. So we have this probably a mental block or a mental institution in our minds that when we hear the word Pharisee, we immediately think evil. Evil leaders or evil Jews. But that's not true at all, because Jesus was very much a Pharisee. His system of faith, his belief was Pharisaic. He wasn't a Sadducee. He wasn't that. He wasn't a secular Israelite as well. At that time you had zealots, you had Essenes, you had Pharisees, you had Sadducees, and you had fallen away Jews who were nothing. Well, Jesus fit only into the Pharisaic movement. The Pharisees were the people of the common faith of Israel at that time. And they were Bible believers. The Sadducees were not. The Zealots, many of them were Pharisees, but they tended to be more Essenes. Who were the Essenes? The Essenes were a people who removed themselves from civilization, a Jewish people who excluded themselves from the daily life of Israel. Their position was that the temple was corrupt, Malachi. The temple was corrupt. The priesthood was corrupt, and so the temple wasn't actually a holy place. The Kavod Yehovah wasn't even there. We're going to go off into the wilderness and wait for the coming of Messiah. They were the Assyrians. And you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls, and we're going to go there this year, was written and hidden in those caves by the Assyrians. The Assyrian movement was a powerful movement. In fact, when Judah Maccabee began to fight against the Seleucid Empire, they were Assyrians then. And it says it then in the first book of Maccabee that the Assyrians came and joined themselves to Judah Maccabee, and they were a strong support. The Assyrians were capable warriors. They were zealous, they would pick up the sword quickly. So some of the zealots in Jerusalem were in fact Assyrians who came to purify Jerusalem, to bring Jerusalem to holiness. But Jesus wasn't a zealot. He wasn't an Assyrian. He was a Pharisee. And we need to see that because it's real. When Jesus addressed the Pharisees in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 23, that's when he really, really addressed the Pharisees. He wasn't referring to the Pharisaic movement. He was referring to the leaders of the Pharisees who had become completely corrupt, namely the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin, who were the 70 leaders of Israel, they were all plants of Herod. And Herod was a plant of Pontius Pilate, who was doing the bidding of Rome, Caesar. Right? So there was a political structure there that was unhealthy for Israel. So the Pharisees that Jesus addressed were members of the Sanhedrin and their cronies who were completely corrupt. And so when you look at Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is addressing the Sadducees, the scribes, and the Pharisees. Not all the scribes were unholy and unrighteous. Many of the scribes were righteous and consecrated. But there was that in Jerusalem particularly, there was that element of corruption. And that's what Jesus addressed. Jesus was a Pharisee. So the Pharisaic movement, you can say, was established by Ezra, the teacher. All right, so what else about Ezra can we say? Again, a very profound character in the life of Israel. The great reformer Ezra. Martin Luther was a reformer for Christianity. Okay, but Martin Luther can't begin to compare to Ezra. Not even close. Martin Luther didn't do as much as Ezra did. What did Luther do? He saw the reality of justification by faith. He was courageous. You think Ezra was courageous? He was courageous, and he stood up against the Roman Catholic institution. He wrote an essay, tacked it on the door, and ran off. That's what he did. Run away! And he went home, and then they read the essay, and wow, everybody was excited about it. And that began the Reformation. But he only touched on one little issue. Ezra brought the Torah back to life and brought the entire nation of Israel to obedience to Torah. That's a reformer. Martin Luther could have gone further, but he didn't. So the real reformer that I look at is, of course, Ezra. We wouldn't have today Judaism as we know it, or the Jewish faith as we know it, if it wasn't for Ezra. And then, of course, Nehemiah. Nehemiah was, of course, with the exiles, he was a cupbearer for Artaxerxes. King Artaxerxes was a great king. I think he was Medo, I'm not sure. That's something we can fact check. I think he was Medo, not Persian. But at any rate, he was a great king. He was a warring king and a great ruler at the same time. His cupbearer was Nehemiah. Now, the position of a cupbearer is very important. Okay? Why? Because people wanted to kill the kings. They wanted to poison the kings. You know the story of Xerxes and Mordecai. Two men wanted to kill him. There were two spies in the palace who wanted to poison him, wanted to kill him. And Mordecai exposed them. Mordecai wasn't a cupbearer, but he was a gatekeeper. And the function of the gatekeeper is to ensure that whoever comes in is okay. The gatekeeper is another important role in the ancient kingdom world, but the cupbearer had a very important position. You know the story of Pharaoh and his cupbearer, right? He allowed his cupbearer to live because the position of the cupbearer is very important. You have to be well trusted. You were a eunuch for sure. I mean, a eunuch in that you were castrated, literally castrated. Now, why was it important, imperative to castrate those close to the king? Now, for obvious reason, right? Because if you had men who were not castrated close to the king, then the king's concubines and even the king's wife will not be entirely safe. It's kind of brutal, but it was exactly the way it was. Daniel and his friends were all castrated. They were all eunuchs in that sense. And so here we have Nehemiah, a cupbearer. Certainly he was a eunuch, chosen by the king Artaxerxes to become the governor of Jerusalem. Because the king recognized in him that he had leadership potential. He had to, because he was a cupbearer. He was a high-ranked official in the kingdom. And so he was appointed, recognized by the king, and appointed to be governor of Jerusalem. His real ministry, Nehemiah, was to assist Zerubbabel in the building up of the walls and the building of the temple. Zerubbabel did a lot to secure also the temple, to actually fortify the walls around the temple so that the temple would not be easily infiltrated by the heathens. And Nehemiah's ministry was to bolster both Ezra and Zerubbabel, and he was governor. That's what he did. There's some, when you read the book of Nehemiah, there's some wonderful scripture in there about Nehemiah and his work as a governor, and you should read it. So what else can we say about Nehemiah? Probably we'll look at some more as we go along. And then the story of Esther. Now, why is the story of Esther included in this part of Bible prophecy? It's not in the prophets. It's way back here, together with the Psalms. Why is it included in Bible prophecy with these particular prophets? Because it's dealing with the same time period. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Mordecai, King Artaxerxes or King Xerxes. Excuse me. So it's all tied together. Who's Esther? Esther was a Jewish lass, young lady. No telling how young she was when she was chosen. She was probably 14, 15, 13 or something, very young. They would choose these girls very young. Once you get up in age, you're married or you're too old. And getting up in age is 20 and above. And that's just the way it was back then. A maiden was chosen very young. As soon as she began to show signs of puberty, being able to bear children, she was then ready for marriage. And certainly Esther was in that category. She was probably very young when she was chosen. Her actual identity, and her name was Hadassah. Her identity was she was probably of the house of David. At any rate, she was closely associated with the leading class of the dispersed Jews, because she was related to Mordecai. Again, Mordecai wasn't just any Jew. Mordecai was very important to be the gatekeeper of the king of all the world. And he was the gatekeeper of the king of Persia, who's the king of the entire world. Very, very important position. His position was so important that Haman saw him as a threat. Haman was second to the king, and Haman saw Mordecai as a threat. I know that's true. We'll talk about that in 2 weeks. I know it's true because Haman wanted to kill him. And then when the whole thing shook, when the whole thing came together, shook out, Mordecai was in the position of Haman. So Haman saw him that way. Haman knew that Mordecai was coming behind him. And so Mordecai was a very important Jew, and so his niece, Hadassah, would have also been a very important class in Persia. So she was probably a descendant of the house of David. Before we take a break, the Jews of Susa, they're not there anymore. You know, Susa was the capital of the Persian Empire, right? Very important city. Alexander the Great himself destroyed Susa and pursued Darius, chased him out of Susa, pursued him into the mountains, the same mountains that many of the tribes of Israel settled in, Peshmerga. and killed him. Susa was the capital of Persia and remained the capital of Persia for 1,200 years after Persia was taken by the Grecians. In other words, during the time of the Second Temple era, Jesus, even after, up until around the 9th century, Susa was the capital of the Persian Empire. In other words, when you looked at ancient Babylon, I'm talking about at the time of Jesus, during the time of the writing of the Talmud, Susa was the center of that entire thing. We think, oh, it must have been Baghdad. No, it wasn't Baghdad. Baghdad really didn't exist. And where Nimrod's kingdom was once located, Ur of the Chaldeans, was just a heap of rubble. Susa was the capital of the Eastern world. So Susa was a very important center. Susa is where many of the Jews remained, and they were very, 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 very prosperous and powerful in Susa for hundreds of years. When Islam came into being, and Islam finally crept over to Persia, which is today's Iran, when Islam came into the picture, that's when the Jews of Susa couldn't be comfortable in Susa anymore. And the majority of the Jews in Susa were the upper class, upper echelon of the Israeli people. Most of them were the house of David that stayed there from the time of Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah and so on. Mordecai. So in Susa there was a strong population, very strong, viable population of Israelis, Jews. When Islam raided that part of the East, it took them a while to get over from the Saudi Arabian Peninsula and into that Persian area. The uncle of Muhammad, I think the uncle of the cousin, Ali, took on the campaign of conquering Persia, and he did. In very short time, the Jews of Persia had to flee and find a place to be. When Muhammad conquered Medina, for instance, and this what I'm sharing with you right now is tied in with Jewish history, which we will look at in a couple of weeks. When Muhammad conquered Medina, he murdered many of the Medinan Jews. The Medinan Jews were weapon makers, swords and so on. And they were very good weapon makers. They made weapons for Muhammad. A lot of the weapons that Muhammad used were actually manufactured by the Jews of Medina. So when he turned against them and used their own swords to destroy them, many of the Medinan Jews fled to Spain. And that's why so many Spaniards have the last name Medina. Right? Medina is a very common last name in Spain and Portugal to some extent, more so in Spain, because floods of Medinan Jews came into Spain, and they were known as Abraham de Medina. Abraham from Medina, right? And so Medina became a very common last name in Spain because of that. But then comes the Jews from Susa, because Ali, the cousin of, or the uncle of Muhammad, went into Persia, Susa, began to flush the Jews out. The majority of those Jews did not go to Northern Europe or Eastern Europe. Life was very hard there. They made their way across the Mediterranean to Spain and Portugal. So after the 9th centuries, when Spain and Portugal began to become known as the golden, those centuries became known as the golden era of Judaism in Spain and Portugal, because Spain and Portugal received all of those Jews from Medina and from Susa. And so many of the Jews who came into Spain and Portugal from Susa, they carried very, very typical names, or they embraced very typical Jewish names as they were converted. Because then came the forced conversions, and some of the names that they took were relevant to where they came from. And that's why you have Spanish names like Sosa, Soto, and other Spanish names, Shusha, that are actually relevant to the Jews who came from Susa. A very common Portuguese and Spanish name is de Sousa. But de Sousa literally means from Susa. So many of the Jews that came from Susa, they had the last name de Sousa, and it was actually saying from Susa. Many of the Jews that came also from that area were called They're Castros. They're Castros because they worked around the castles, the kingdom gods, the kings and their palaces. And they became known as the Castros. And so you have this incredible connection between Medina, not Mecca so much, but Medina. Mecca was just taken over by Muhammad. Mecca was actually the ancestral home of Muhammad and his tribe. Medina is where he learned about Judaism. In fact, Islam is sort of the derivation of Judaism. A lot of the factors of Islam we see today came from Judaism, from the Jews of Medina. And so the Jews of Susa are the ones who really made Spain to be a strong Jewish. In fact, there was a time in Jewish history that Spain and Portugal were considered to be New Israel. New Israel. And that's when they became too comfortable, and then the Inquisition and the forced conversions came. So Hadassah was definitely upper class, more than likely descended from the house of David. All right, let's take a break and we'll come back at 25 after 9 and we'll begin to look at class 2. I'm not sure how far we'll get. We'll get far enough. So take a break. All right, so now let's get to class 2. We've got all of 1/2 an hour. Class 2 is basically, there's nothing really there for me to really teach. I can teach on it, but it's just going to be going through what's already in here. So what I would like for you to do is to read class 2. I'm going to point out the important aspects of class 2. So you have, if you recall, we said that the Bible, there are 5 consistent themes of Bible prophecy, which were the restoration of Israel. I'll put them up on the board for us to see. Restoration, whoa, nice arrow. Of Israel. Then there was of Zion. Zion. And then there is, in fact, the great king. So we've looked at this 3 times before, right? I'm just putting it on the board for the sake of putting it on the board. And then the 4th theme of Bible prophecy is judgment of the nations, universal judgment. Now, like we've talked about before when looking at Bible prophecy, judgment of the nations always comes after the restoration of Israel. Okay? So it's God's plan, restore Israel to the land of Israel, and as that happens simultaneously, he's preparing to judge the nations. Universal judgment. And then we have the new creation. So these are the consistent themes that we find in all prophets, in all of the 4 categories of prophets. That is consistent. Some more than others in that regard. All right, so let's talk about the restoration of Israel as it relates to these prophets. They didn't place a whole lot of emphasis on this theme. Why? Someone tell me why these particular prophets did not place a great deal of emphasis on the restoration of Zion. Remember, these are prophets to the restoration, to the remnant. They didn't put a lot of emphasis on that because they were convinced that they were the restoration, that they were part of the ultimate restoration of Israel. In other words, all of the references that we find in Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Hosea, Amos, and all of those prophets, these prophets believed that they were living in that time, but they were not. Because this was a temporary ingathering, a temporary restoration, partial. They didn't know that at the time. All right, so they didn't necessarily know or want to believe that the temple would be destroyed yet again, and then there will be a final leg in the diaspora, in the dispersion. Even though Isaiah said in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11, as I said earlier, that God said that he would bring them back a second time. And what he inferred or what he implied in Isaiah chapter 11 is that the second ingathering will be the big one. Right, the second time is when he would lift up the standard, the ensign to the nations, and bring them all back. So they didn't look at it that way, and so for that reason, they didn't put a lot of emphasis on the restoration of Israel. Their focus was really the glorification of Zion because it had to do with the temple, right? The great king, the Mashiach, the coming of the Mashiach for sure, and Zechariah with the judgment of the nations. So now the glorification of Zion, these prophets had a little bit to say in that regard. Of course, they would because of the nature of their ministry, right? Haggai had a bit to say about the glorification of Zion because he was ministering to the building up of the temple and with the hope that once the temple is rebuilt, that Zion will be filled with God's glory. What he saw and what he prophesied was correct, but it wasn't for that period. He was seeing and making reference of something that would be in the future. Of course, I believe they would have had a sense of that. Someone read in Haggai, it's a very small book, right after Zephaniah. Haggai chapter 2, verse 9. Anyone? Haggai chapter 2, verse 9. You go to Zephaniah, you turn right. It's snuggled right between Zephaniah and Zechariah. Chapter 2, verse 9.
You looked for much, and lo, it was
Mm-hmm.
too little, and when you brought it home,
Haggai. Haggai chapter 2, verse 9.
oh, I'm on one. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Excuse me. The glory of this latter house will be greater than that of the former, says the Lord of hosts.
Right.
I shall give peace in its place, in this place, says the Lord of hosts.
So, from Haggai's standpoint, he's holding out, believing that this house, the glory of this house, will be greater than the first. What is he referring to? The first is Solomon's temple. And the glory of Solomon's temple was profound because the Kavod Yehovah filled the temple, right? 2 Chronicles chapter 7. And it was profound. It was God's glory was there. Ezekiel saw the glory of God being removed from that temple. Well, what Haggai is saying that the latter temple, the glory will be greater than the first one. What is happening here is this edifice, from God's point of view, is barely a temple to begin with. It's not a temple because a temple is where a deity lives or dwells. That's a temple. This second temple does not qualify as a temple because God isn't there. He is not dwelling there. All right? He's not manifest in his glory. He's there because he said that my eyes and my ears will always be attentive to the prayer offered up in this place, referring to the Temple Mount, the environment of Jerusalem, right? His eyes and his ears will always be there. So Jerusalem, Zion, will always be that relevant to God. But his Kavod Yehovah, the glory of God, the manifest, the Shekinah glory, the indwelling glory of God is not there. It's not a temple. So the second temple, or the temple that Haggai is referring to, is actually the third temple. And we know that because of what we saw in Ezekiel, right? Ezekiel chapter 40 to 46. The glory of God fills that temple. Yes?
The ark wasn't there at all, right?
That's a good question. We don't know if there's evidence that the ark wasn't there. There's no mention of the ark. All right. So we know the menorah was there because we have a carving of the menorah being taken into Rome. So the menorah was there. Now, whether or not it was the actual menorah, that Moses made in the wilderness, I doubt it. That menorah, we don't know where that is, even if it does exist. Because Solomon, when the temple was built, he built, I think, he made 6 menorot. And they were all over so there were a bunch of menorahs. Now, but we don't know about the Ark of the Covenant. I'm pretty sure that they didn't build a second Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was probably hidden away by Jeremiah, who was there as the temple was about to be destroyed by the Babylonians. So it is believed that Jeremiah took the Ark of the Covenant and hid it somewhere. Now, there are all sorts of opinions about where the Ark of the Covenant might be. And Jeremiah even say in these days there will be no concern about the Ark of the Covenant because the glory of God will effectively be the Ark of the Covenant. But there is still some significance to the need for the Ark of the Covenant, the box, the golden box, and whether or not it does exist, whether or not the tablets of the commandments are in it. Well, that's a whole different issue. So some people believe that the Ark of the Covenant, we're not going to get far. The Ark of the Covenant is somewhere on Mount Nebo, which is across from Gilgal in Jordan. I'm pretty sure that enough people have searched for it. In every little cave, every little crook and the cranny, they've looked for the Ark of the Covenant there, and I'm pretty sure that no one has found it, because I don't think it's at Mount Nebo. It's believed that it's there. Some people said that Baruch, who was Jeremiah's scribe, one of his scribes, took it into Ethiopia. And right now you can go to Ethiopia and there's a church that's very oddly built, kind of sunken into the earth, where they say they have the Ark of the Covenant. Pretty sure they do not have the Ark of the Covenant. It's sort of a myth and they hold on to it. But they believe that the Ark of the Covenant is there. The Ethiopians do, and so on. And there's been a lot of research, documentaries done on it, going down there, people trying to pay their way into the church building where the Ark of the Covenant supposedly is. Trust me, if the Ark was really there, it would have been photographed and proven a long time ago. It's not there, and that's why no one has ever seen it, because it's not there. There might be something made to be like an ark in there, but it's not there. The most viable possibility for the Ark of the Covenant is in Jerusalem. It's hidden somewhere in Jerusalem. Now, there's another theory, and this has to do with Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia. You've heard of the money pit. You've heard of the money pit. There's a series on cable TV. What's the name of the island? The money pit on what's that island in Nova Scotia? 2 guys. The money pit on. It'll come to me. Anyway, there's a show on. There's a series on cable. And 2 guys have purchased the rights to the money pit. What's the money pit? It's a 600-year-old pit that pirates or mercenaries or British, they don't know who actually buried something. The Oak Island. Oak Island. So there's an island there called Oak Island where the money pit is in Nova Scotia. And the lure of this is pretty involved. And here's the lure of it, or the lore of it. That the Crusaders, and there's a lot of evidence that there were Crusaders on the island, a lot of evidence that there were actually Crusaders there, that the Crusaders dug into Jerusalem and excavated way down under the Temple Mount and found the Ark of the Covenant that Jeremiah stashed way down in the middle of the Temple Mount. And they took the Ark of the Covenant out, having found it, and they brought the Ark of the Covenant to Europe. The Crusaders did. The so-called, what's the name for these Crusaders? I don't keep up with it anymore. There's an order, a holy order that the Crusaders call themselves. at whatever. The Knights of the Templar Knights, the Knights of the Templar, I guess they call themselves. And these Templar Knights, who were sworn to secrecy of a higher order of knighthood, had the Ark of the Covenant with them, brought from Palestine, from the land of Israel, up through the Mediterranean and up to England and Scotland. And they had it stashed over there, first in France, Normandy, according to the law, and then in England, Scotland, and from Scotland, apparently, according to the law, church authorities in England, the Anglican Church, knew that they had the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant became hot merchandise, and people were being killed for it, and so on. So then the Knight Templars put it on a ship, the Ark of the Covenant, and brought it over to the Western Hemisphere, where Europeans have been coming for centuries and centuries and centuries. It was a big secret that Europeans were coming over here. They were coming here before Columbus, long before Columbus. And so, and they stashed it away on this island, Oak Island, and it's buried in this pit. That's the lore. And there are all sorts of curses on the island, and the 7 men must die before it's discovered, and they're up to 6 right now. So according to the curse, the lore, 1 more person is going to die before they discover the treasure, which the Ark of the Covenant is a part of. And people swear by that. There's a whole cultic movement that's behind that. But I believe if the Ark does exist, it's still in Jerusalem. It's still buried somewhere under the Temple Mount. Of course, you know about Wyatt, what's his name? Ron Wyatt. Ron Wyatt believes that the Ark of the Covenant is in the Garden Tomb. It's buried under Golgotha, which is Calvary. He believes it's 40 feet under Golgotha. From the base at the park to the top of Golgotha is about 20 feet. And so he's saying that it's 40 feet under Golgotha, so it's 20 feet underground level at the park. How many of you had been at the park, the Garden Tomb Park? Right. So according to him, it's buried there 20 feet under Calvary is where the Ark of the Covenant is. In 1982 or something, him and his sons went down there and found it and took pictures of it. You can find the pictures on the internet. There's a whole narrative behind it, and it's impressive. The story is impressive. I'm not going to say no to that at all. I've listened to his deathbed confession many times. I've watched him when he talked about the find, and he gets really emotional, but there's something about him that says he's dreaming at the same time. But at his deathbed, he was about to die, and he confessed, and he swore that his story about the Ark of the Covenant is true. And he died. He was a believer. He was a spirit-filled believer, but there was something about him whenever I observe him, I look for his countenance, I look for his demeanor, looking to see if he's real, and there was something about him that tells me that he's a dreamer. But then I can't say that, because he's made some really incredible discoveries. The Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia, he was the guy that discovered it. It was always there, but he's the guy that brought the reality of Musa Jabal, the mountain of Moses, to the Western Hemisphere. He went there with his sons and camped out in this place where the altar is and the pillars are, the cave in the rock. He brought the reality of Mount Sinai being in Saudi Arabia to the Western world. He got arrested for it. He almost died. They were going to kill him and his sons. And divine intervention, he got out of it. So he's credible from that point of view. He's credible because he discovered the Noah's Ark. He discovered it. And when I say discovered it, what he did, he was an explorer, right? He was an Indiana Jones type. He went to Mount Ararat, interacted with the locals on Mount Ararat in that environment, and they say, yeah, we know where it is. Let me show you where it is. And so he goes up there, and he takes photographs, he does wood samples and stuff, and yeah, there is something that is shaped like the ark, same size, same dimension, made of wood. It's on the ground. It's there. So He brought that to the Western world as well. What else? He went to, Ron Wyatt went to the region of Sodom and Gomorrah and literally with his penknife dug out sulfur balls. And he said, look at this, sulfur balls everywhere. He put it on a rock, put a big lighter to it, and it lit. And so he determined that the areas that he went to and filmed was Sodom and Gomorrah. And he was right. And he was the guy that went in there. Now, he wasn't this great discoverer. All Ron Wyatt did was he went into the areas and communicated with the locals and got information, but brought it to the Western world. So he was working at the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem in the late 70s, early 80s, and he was walking past, the Garden Tomb was now being set up at that time. He was walking past an area right next to Golgotha, Calvary, and he said the Holy Spirit spoke to him right there and says that there is Jeremiah's grotto. There it is. In other words, where Jeremiah hid the Ark of the Covenant. And that he said he heard the Holy Spirit speak to him, and from that point on, he was convinced that the Ark of the Covenant was buried there. And he had an Israeli friend who was an archaeologist, and he said to the guy, he says, it's there, that's where the Ark is. And they doubted him and they made fun of him, but he said, the Holy Spirit told me it's there. So him and his sons, they got permission to dig and excavate. They began to excavate. And there's videos of them cutting into the ground, digging it out. And they worked real hard. I mean, him and his two sons. They worked night and day, and they had some helpers, bucket after bucket, just pulling dirt out and stones. And finally, they got to an enclosement. And there is evidence that he did get to an enclosement, because you can get the video. It's on the internet, where he came up to this wall, punched a hole through it, and according to him, in there, he saw glittering gold. That's what he saw. He saw the gold that's on the wing of the cherubim. Took a picture of it. You see the picture, it's very blurry. It's not real clear, but you do see something. And the story gets even more amazing, because he said he got close enough to where the ark was, and he noticed on the wall that there was a black stain coming down the wall, coming from a crack in the ceiling. Black. And so he wondered what that line of black was. What was it? And it seemed to be coming down right over where the Ark of the Covenant was. This is fantastic, right? Well, according to the story, he took his penknife again and he took a piece of that black substance off the wall, had it tested, and it was blood. It was blood. And the Israeli outfit that tested the blood said it's very unusual. It has 22 chromosomes, meaning that he had one parent. The person that the blood belonged to had one parent. And this is fact. Now, there's documented evidence on record of the doctors saying we don't understand it. He took the blood sample to Europe, and the same thing. And the same thing happened. They said it's very unusual blood. The blood is ancient, but it's still active, they said. And it has 22 chromosomes, because I think normal blood has 23 chromosomes. One chromosome is from the father, the paternal side, and the maternal side, you get 22 chromosomes. So, and that's his story. And he lived and he died by it. Now, I can't say that's, it's an incredible, in other words, Jesus was crucified on top of that mountain. Remember, the story says that the earth split and it cracked wide open. The blood of Jesus, which was all spilt, went down into the rock and dripped on the Ark of the Covenant, in keeping with the Levitical order, because that's how you would purify the. So that's the story behind it, that the Ark of the Covenant was dripped upon by the blood of Jesus, signifying that it's some great completion. I don't know. I do know this, that right there, where the cut in the ground is, up until about 4 years ago, it was open, but they had an iron plate on there with some huge padlocks. The Israeli authorities had it locked down. You couldn't miss it. You walk past the spot, there's a huge plate on there, big thick iron plate, and it's bolted to the ground, 3 or 4 padlocks on it. Big heavy ones. And so they were keeping it secure. Well, about 4 years ago, they built a pavilion right on top of it. So someone had the great idea that, well, it's good, people are finding out about this now. The internet, it's not so good. So we just put a pavilion on top of it. No one's going to come looking for the opening into the place where the Ark of the Covenant is. And no one does, because the pavilion is right there. About 3 years ago, we worshipped in that pavilion, that right above the cut in the ground. They just put us in that pavilion. When you go there, you don't ask for a place to worship. They give you a place. And we got allotted that same spot. And I got to tell you, it was pretty powerful what happened. I'm not sure if any of you were with us when we did that, worshipped in that little pavilion, but the Holy Spirit was pretty intense. There was an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. It was intense. Right there, in the same spot. I don't know. I'm not saying that the Ark of the Covenant is there, or this story of Ron Wyatt is true, but it's a fantastic story. And if it was true, it would be amazing, actually. If it was true, I don't know. I do know that Ron Wyatt took it to the grave and swore by it. People that knew him personally said he was a rational man. He was never insane. He had a lot of visions. He had a lot of ideas of doing things and discovering things. But the story about the Ark of the Covenant, the people that knew him best said that they believe it was real. So we're going to go there again. I'm not sure if they're going to put us in that pavilion. If it's there, it's fantastic. If it's there, the Israeli authorities know where it is. And that's probably why the hole was never filled. 1, 2, it's covered up, it's secure. I mean, that plate is there forever until whoever has the key for it would open it up and get to it. So the possibility is this. Possibility. The Ark is there, according to Ron Wyatt. The Israeli authorities are fully aware of it, and they're just waiting for that temple to be rebuilt, and perhaps they will dig it out. And the table of showbread is there as well from Jeremiah's time. So now, if this is true, and if the Ark of the Covenant, if the menorah is there as well, which it might be, then we're talking about the menorah that was built in the wilderness. We're talking about the table of showbread that was built in the wilderness, right? The originals, in other words. If this is true, the original items are under that temple, under that rock, Calgata, the rock of Calvary. Yes?
My question is then, how did the Kohanim, how were they able to perform their priestly duties if the ark was not there?
They didn't. It's kind of like Judaism today. Judaism today, they're void of a temple. There's no temple. And so they do things that are indicative or representative of what was done in the temple. So there's no mention in the New Testament at all of the Ark of the Covenant being there. And so...
But the high priest would have gone into the Holy of Holies anyway?
Yeah.
To an empty room?
To an empty room. Because it would have been, from their point of view, sacrilege to put any other box in there. And I think certainly they would have not, if they had the actual Ark of the Covenant, it would have been recorded in the book of Ezra or the book of Nehemiah. But there's nothing like that.
But they continued to make sacrifices.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, sacrifices has very little to do with the Ark of the Covenant, except on Yom Kippur. So it's, again, Israel went through a traumatic period where their whole national identity was ripped away from them. Temple service and all those things were completely, they were depleted of all of that because the Babylonians took whatever utensils they had, and we know how that worked out. So whatever they did by necessity, and the Ark of the Covenant wasn't there. The Kavod Yehovah wasn't there. The glory of God wasn't there. So the whole temple, in the Second Temple period, the whole temple worship was different. It wasn't. They had a temple. They had some things in it, but they didn't have the essentials, which were the Ark of the Covenant and the glory of God. Now, the Ark could have been there, but according to what we see and according to history, Jeremiah hid the Ark. And it wasn't. Why would they bring the Ark out if they knew where it was? For the Grecians to take it, or for the Romans to take it. The Ark of the Covenant was a desired piece of furniture. So I think they would have kept it stashed away. And so if the story of Ron Wyatt is true, well, they know where it is, and they're just waiting for the right opportunity to bring it out. It would make sense, because why would they not fill the hole completely and just cover it up with dirt and move on? Why would they put heavy metal on it and lock it down 3 times with padlocks and then build a pavilion right on top of it? That's the only way in. So there is something to it. Who knows? At any event, the Ark of the Covenant is no substitute for the glory of God that we will return in. So we become that ark. The church becomes that mercy seat that God will rule from. In Jesus. All of this in Yeshua, of course. He's the high priest. So next week we'll try and expedite and we want to try and get through Prophets 4 as expeditiously as we could, so we can begin in our New Testament studies. But there's some things that we have to stop and take a look at. This class, like I said, class 2 is important, but you can read it and glean from it whatever you want. Next week, we're going to look at the book of Esther. And we're going to begin to talk about the book of Esther. Maybe we